Okay, we are going to be looking at the Civil War that had been building up for some time, and we're going to look at how the issues were resolved after the Civil War in the Reconstruction era. So, again, we know that the issues of the causes of the Civil War have been mounting, such as tariffs, such as the economy, such as the bank, such as internal improvements, such as westward expansion, also the religious movement in the Second Great Awakening to challenging the abolitionists, to challenging the Southerners with their slavery. And we're going to see that eventually, with the election of 1860, South Carolina has promised to secede, and they do. And again, when this election happens, the South says that they are leaving because they're fighting for state rights, which is, again, the credo of what the Democrats believe in. And also, when they leave, a lot of it filtering from the Panic of 1857 that they could be their own nation, they are seeking foreign recognition because, yes, they make cotton, but they also need things to fight a war, and they need help from other nations to be able to withstand the invasion of the North if they do. Again, when the North at the start, they say that they're fighting to preserve the Union. And again, Lincoln is very, very careful of not saying abolish slavery. Again, he says no expansion of slavery into the territories, but he doesn't say abolish slavery because he would lose the border states such as Maryland, which is in the capital, has the capital, Kentucky, and which is also important because it's an industrial center. Eventually, throughout the war, he will change that non-expansion of slavery to end slavery after Antietam and in Gettysburg. So we're going to see with the election of 1860, South Carolina and 6 other states will secede as soon as Lincoln was elected president. Many of them look at his platform of non-extension of slavery as an attack on them because this would mean that no other slave states would come into the Union, and that this would upset the balance in the Senate. Again, they are firm believers in a Dred Scott decision that slavery can exist anywhere, and Congress trying to abolish it cannot happen because slaves are private property. We're going to see there's problems again with secession because America's not so easily divided. There's no defining geography. Both sides owe debt. There is the territories, also the issue of fugitive slaves. And so we're going to see the border states that stayed united with the Union is Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And again, they're really important, and this is why Lincoln cannot take a stance saying that he wants to abolish slavery. He says that he doesn't want the extension of slavery. Again, in these areas, they have a high proportion of slaves. That's why they would leave if Lincoln taken that abolitionist stance. They control the rivers and they also have D.C. If they would secede, they would surround D.C., and D.C. would quickly be captured. So Lincoln must keep the border states because if they were added to the South, that would give them industrial centers where they could produce weapons, and then the capital. So the South strategies for the war is to get foreign aid, invade the North whenever possible, and hold out until the North tires out and gives up. The North, however, they have the Anaconda Plan that we had talked about, the blockade of the southern coast, prevent in items from coming in, such as manufactured goods they would need to fight the war, cut the South in half by capturing the Mississippi River, which we know the Mississippi is where items come in from Mexico, up I-35 down 20 to Vicksburg, and eventually Vicksburg will be captured, capture Richmond, their capital. Total war is also part of that, and liberate the slaves will come eventually. We're going to see the advantage of each side. The South has a devotion. They have a cause. They have a passion. They are fighting on their home turf, so they know the surroundings. Also, if we think about a typical Southerner, they're used to this life, and they are more experienced sharpshooters. They have better generals, and eventually when Virginia leaves, they have outstanding military leaders such as Lee. The North, on the other hand, they have mass amounts of resources. They have the industrial centers, they have manufacturing, they have money, they have food, they have more people, they have the railroads, more states, and a superior navy. So again, the South really needs a quick war. The North could hold out if it's a prolonged war. In financing the war, both sides do the same things. They raise bonds, which are IOUs the government borrows from the people and promising to pay them back. They both increase the excise tax. They both will print paper money, which we'll see will lead to inflation. They both implement tariffs. The South will get loans from Europe. And the North will actually implement the first income tax. This is not the 16th Amendment. This is the precursor to it. In raising the army, they're both going to be the same. They first rely on volunteers. Eventually, state militias will come in. We will see the draft, the conscription. They will hire people. We will see there's ways to evade the draft. We're going to see that if you hire a substitute in the North, or you pay $300, you could get an exemption. In the South, you could use your slaves and you could be exempt from the war. We're going to see by the end of the war, the Union Army is going to rely on African Americans, but we're only going to have one group that will actually face real combat. Okay, desertion is a problem on both sides. So our first real event that kickstarts the war is the Battle of Fort Sumter. We know that South Carolina and 6 other states have left the Union with Lincoln's election, but the event that is going to cause some other border states to leave is the events at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is Union soil in South Carolina. They have not surrendered. The provisions are running weak here. And we're going to see Lincoln will write a letter to the president of the Confederacy saying that he wants to send provisions. They take provisions to be weapons, and the fort will be attacked before Lincoln had sent reinforcements, and we will see the Union will surrender here, and this will lead to 4 other states leaving. Both sides begin to mobilize troops. Our first true battle is at the Battle of Bull Run. This is at Manassas Junction. It is 30 miles south of D.C. We know that the South has better soldiers. We know the Union has a lot more men, but they're not as good quality as a Southern soldier. This event, we're going to see that many people have not seen a war, and many spectators will come out from the North to watch the battle. We are going to see the Southerners actually be victorious. And our soldiers are going to flee to the North. And our spectators who are here start fleeing too, but they have brought their picnic baskets and dates. And they're going to flee, leaving all that stuff there. And we're going to see our Southerners face an issue. Continue pressing on to D.C. or stop and have a picnic. And we know one of the biggest issues with the Southerner is that they had a lack of resources and lack of food. And many of those Southerners will sit down and have a picnic. After that, many of them will desert to go home because they think the war is over. Many of them will go look for dessert. And many of them will take siestas. And because they don't press on to D.C., we're going to see the Union is going to get more serious about fighting and realize that they have to train their soldiers better. And this will prolong the war. The war could have been done right here. Naval warfare will actually improve. We're going to see the Merrimack is going to be a Southern boat that is going to be an ironclad that has iron sides to ram through the blockade. The Monitor is going to be the modern revolutionary naval design that has a pivotal gun. Okay, we're going to talk about the war in 2 different fronts. One is the Western Front and one is the Eastern Front. The Western Front is really capturing the Mississippi to stop the resources from coming in. So the Western Front is just basically taking the Mississippi, specifically Vicksburg. Vicksburg is the lifeline to the South. This is where all of the weapons, along with New Orleans, are coming into. And so we're going to see Ulysses S. Grant put in charge of this area. And we know him as Unconditional Surrender Grant. And eventually he will capture Vicksburg. And this will prevent the continuous voyage of items from Texas through Mexico coming into the Union, into the Confederacy. And so there, it's going to hit hard. And it happens on July 4th, along with another battle that will happen at the same time that will basically ruin their help of foreign aid. We're going to see after this, Grant will be promoted and Sherman will take the march to the sea, where he will burn everything to the ground from from Atlanta to Savannah. So Grant will eventually be promoted to the Eastern Front, but Lincoln was having a lot of trouble with the Army of the Potomac. He had leaders that had too many issues, and he will eventually settle on Grant. We see the first Battle of Antietam. is a real bloody day in the war. This is when Lee is trying to come around DC to get in the back door because he can't get in the front door after the Battle of Bull Run. And we're going to see that amidst this, Lee loses his plans. It is given to George McClellan. George McClellan is able to attack. And this is one of the bloodiest days of the war. And because of this, Lincoln is going to give the Emancipation Proclamation. I always remember Antietam with Emancipation because American Eagle, Antietam and Emancipation. And this Emancipation Proclamation was supposed to set free slaves in the rebelling states. So in the Confederacy, again, where he could free the slaves, that's in the border states, he didn't because they would leave. Where he couldn't, that's in the Confederate states, he did. So we're going to see the Emancipation Proclamation really doesn't free many people. But because now he's changing the cause of the war to, instead of saving the Union, but setting the precedent that we are going to free slaves, he will basically doom the South from getting foreign recognition. We know the Emancipation Proclamation really doesn't strike a shackle of a slave eventually until the 13th Amendment. Okay, Gettysburg is a last attempt of Lee to come around and capture the railroads into DC to invade and the back door. And he doesn't get in the railroads, and it's a turning point of the war because it basically shows Lee cannot run an offensive, and the South starts to retreat. We're eventually going to see Grant is promoted, and he will chase down Lee, and he will get his surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee will surrender, but Grant allows the officers to keep their firearms, the soldiers to keep their horses, and he gives them food. Again, he's not being very malicious in his terms of surrender because, again, they have to reconcile after this time period. We're going to see that they also have to go back and rebuild, and they'll need those items. Okay, in foreign affairs, we're going to see that the Trent Affair is when the U.S. will seize some Confederate leaders off a British mail steamer, and this is almost going to lead to the war with the British, but the U.S. will return the diplomats in this effort of impressment. We're going to see the Alabama controversy is when the British are bringing in layered rams that are that have iron sights to break in the blockade, and they're sending weapons to the South. The legacy of the war is that the South is devastated in their infrastructure. The idea of secession and nullification is dead. And we're going to see that they're going to lack reliable labor for the next 100 years, but eventually they're going to put Jim Crow laws in to keep Southern blacks in that perpetual state of servitude. And we're going to see the Democratic Party is going to rule for the next 100 years up until the Civil Rights Movement, when Truman and FDR and LBJ take on civil rights as a Democratic Party platform. The North, we're going to see its economy is going to boom. We're going to see the first millionaires who sell weapons into the military. We're going to see the Republicans will enjoy unprecedented support in Congress for legislation such as railroads to be done. The Transcontinental Railroad will be done. They will increase the tariff. They will pass the Homestead Act that will basically give 160 acres to anybody moving west. So the big problem after the war is over is how to reconstruct, how to reconcile. And Lincoln is going to come in and he says, we need to get this done. There's bigger and better things that we have to look at in rebuilding our economy. So Lincoln's plan is going to be very lenient. He's going to want them to come in quickly. So this is why he has very low bar standards, a 10% oath in the 13th Amendment, which will abolish slavery. He says once they agree to both of these things, they get to form new governments. However, the Republicans in Congress are really upset about this low bar standards, and they've been enjoying their a virtual monopoly of being able to pass legislation without the Democrats circumventing them. And so they're going to pass the Wade-Davis bill that will raise that oath to 50%, have the 13th Amendment in there, and also repudiate the debt. We're going to see Lincoln does not like this because it doesn't lead to rapid readmission and his lenient policy, so he will pocket veto it. Eventually, he's a shot, and this will lead to Johnson coming in and implementing his own policy. And again, Johnson is a war Democrat who stayed in the Union, who will eventually become Lincoln's vice president of the Union Party because to attract those voters. Johnson is a Southerner, and he's going to tote Lincoln's line of being lenient. So he's going to do the 10% oath, the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery. And he's also going to add something in from the Wade-Davis bill, which is the repudiated the Confederate debts. He says if you don't agree to this, Congress wants to get a hold. So he basically scares the Southerners into agreeing to his plan. But when they agree to his plan, they're going to pass some laws called the Black Codes. These Black Codes basically reinstate slavery, but just by another name. And this is an alarm to the people in Congress that the road to recovery after the Civil War is going to be really hard. And so the other thing that's a signal to them that they have no remorse is that if they re-elect ex-Confederate leaders. And so Congress is going to say that Johnson's plan is not working and that Congress should have authority over the admission of these states because by the Northwest Ordinance, they get to admit territories and they get to have control over them and they get to admit them as states. So Congress will come in and get control of Reconstruction. And this is when they do the Congressional Plan number 1, where they claim the 10% oath. They add the 13th Amendment. To that, they add the 14th Amendment that says all African Americans are equal to combat the Black Codes. We're going to see the southern states refuse to ratify the 14th Amendment. And in the midterm elections of 1866, the radical Republicans will get 2/3 control of Congress, which will give them virtual rights to veto. All that veto legislation that Johnson will do, they give them the right to overturn it. So this will lead to military reconstruction. In military reconstruction, we see Congress again comes up with another plan, the 10% oath, 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, 14th Amendment that creates equality for anybody born in America. But they also passed the 15th Amendment, which will give the right to vote for African Americans. Again, this upsets the feminists because it doesn't include women. And then they're going to create military districts where they will secure the rights for African Americans. Amidst all of this, the KKK will rise up, trying to reinstill that social order that they've seen. Force acts will be created to deal with the KKK, but the election of 1876 will happen. In this election, it's the Hayes-Tyndall election. Hayes is the Republican, Tyndall is the Democrat, and it's a very close election, and it comes down to 3 states that have turned in double electoral college votes. A commission is set up by the House of Representatives where there's 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and that commission will decide the Republicans will get the election. The South is outraged because those double votes came from southern states and they should be Democratic. And so what will happen is a compromise. Hayes will win the election, but military reconstruction will end. And with the ending of military reconstruction, we really have no one in the South adhering to the 14th Amendment, making African Americans equal. And this will lead to the foundation of Jim Crow laws. There's no one in the South making sure that African Americans have the right to vote. And this will lead to the passage of ideas such as the literacy test, the poll tax, and the grandfather clause that will inhibit the African American right to vote. So for the next 100 years, this election of 1876 leads to the South going back to exactly what it was. African Americans going to Jim Crow laws, which is a different time of slavery, and where they're still in the service industry. And for the next 100 years, up until the Civil War, African Americans will be second-class citizens.